Well, hello and welcome to Insight with Political Tours and Beyond the Headlines. It's a deal. The UK, minus Northern Ireland, has a trade deal with the EU, and after 4 years of wrangling, Britain and Europe can finally move on. Good news for the Eurosceptics, whose paramount concern has been sovereignty, and a relief for Europe, which sees the principles of its single market left intact. But what does this mean in broader terms? Where does the EU, and Britain for that matter, go from here? This is the first of two discussions we'll have on the subject, and today we're going to focus on the views within Europe. A word of warning, if you're a Brit, some of this might make for uncomfortable listening. We have with us here, joining us, Alex Pigman, Agence France-Presse's Brexit correspondent, based in Brussels. Hello, Alex. You've covered the negotiations.
Hi.
I think from the outset, that's right. You've for the last 4 years, pretty much full time.
Yeah, full time. Basically, since the referendum and up until today. I mean, there's still news happening as we speak. So I've did live most of the highs and lows of the Brexit negotiations from the Brussels side, while we watched what happened and was happening in London through some of the more trickier and enlightening processes, political things happening in the UK.
Well, we're looking forward to hearing more from you. We also have Lolita Cigane, a former chair of Latvia's European Affairs Committee, and now runs a consultancy specializing in elections, governance, and campaign finance. Lolita, you're joining us from Riga, I think.
Yes, that is true.
Okay, well, looking forward to speaking with you. And we also have, last but not least, David Gavigan. David is one of Northern Ireland's best-known businessmen and has the ears of politicians both in Ireland and in London. He's a non-executive director of the CBI and owns a real estate investment firm. Hello, David. You do many other things. I've sold you short, so tell us more.
Well, Nicholas, good evening or good morning, everybody. It's very nice to be with you. Northern Ireland is an interesting place, and I'll talk more about that. But one of my great passions is to see how to make this island work, and particularly Northern Ireland. We're 22 years into the Good Friday Agreement, and the economy of Northern Ireland needs to really move forward. So we'll talk about that.
Okay, great. And I know you're trying to back a fast rail scheme between Dublin and Belfast. So
correct.
I'm sure you'll mention that later as well.
I will.
As I mentioned, this is going to be the first of two discussions we're going to hold. This one will look more closely at Europe's perceptions of Brexit. And for the sake of this argument, we're going to include the island of Ireland as a whole, because Northern Ireland remains within the customs union. Later in January, we'll have a separate talk looking at Brexit's impact in the UK. Alex, I want to start with you. You were on the news desk overnight when Brexit broke. It seems a long time ago then, but it was amazing for all of us, wasn't it? I mean, just take us back to that moment.
Well, it was funny because I was on the overnight shift. I'd sort of volunteered to be, in case everything went crazy and we needed a reaction from Europe in the middle of the night, which wasn't the case. But I volunteered to stay up all night. And when all my colleagues went to bed and went home, I don't know if everyone remembers, but that's when Nigel Farage basically said, "Look, we've lost, but it was a great run, and we'll win the next time." And he was, he was quite defeatist about what was going on. So most journalists, I think most of Great Britain, most of Europe, went to bed thinking, okay, if Nigel Farage himself was saying that it's lost, then it's probably that they voted against leaving the European Union. And then everyone went to sleep, and then I was awake, and then slowly all these results, started coming in, and the whole thing about Sunderland, and me as a sort of a Franco-American, I'm like, what's Sunderland? And you're just sort of discovering all these results coming in from all these various precincts. And then, when my colleagues woke up and it was time for me to go to bed, I was like, hi.
I think it's really important to emphasize that, because we forget how knife edge, and most people presume that the referendum would be won by David Cameron and we'd still be part of the European Union. At least that's what the polls were saying. So it was an enormous surprise, and the consequences, I think we all can agree, are seismic. I'm going to ask you to be simplistic here. You spent 4 years looking at these negotiations. You're able to look back at look over the sort of organisms of the EU structures. What do you think is going to be the biggest consequence for the European Union of Brexit?
It's a tough one to answer, because I think on the first answer has to be is the lack of consequence, in a sense, is that there was so much that we were waiting and everyone was waiting, and obviously the Brexiteers, or a big portion of the Brexiteers, were waiting for, that it would have this massive ripple effect across Europe and across the EU remaining 27, and it just didn't happen. And that was
talking about the idea of like a ripple effect on other
exactly.
other countries imitating the Brexit.
Yeah, and that, the Nigel Farage was this, he's like, the Great Britain is the first to fall, and there'll be a long series afterwards, and everyone, and I think that even within Europe there was a fear of that happening, and what was amazing, and I think the most historic moment for Brexit for me that I lived firsthand, was that those first few weeks when you just realized that the 27 were just completely united. That they were scared, they were freaked out, and the leaders got together and they were like, and you just suddenly very quickly realize that, oh my gosh, there's no oxygen for the more Brexit story. It's gone. This is not. And even like, I'm the most familiar with France. The far right in France was even scared, and everything. It was.
Let me forgive me for busting
in.
Yeah. Almost like an existential threat, and everyone pulled together. But what is the consequence of that? If you think ahead, if you think for the next 5-10 years, what is the consequence of that?
Well, I mean, the fact is that Britain being gone, as far as I can tell, and from everything that we're seeing and everything that's happened in the last, let's say, year, has accelerated European unity, the ever closer union, even though nobody actually really wants it, but it's always just sort of naturally happening. And you're a bit naive to not realize that's what's happening. And Brexit and Britain, as an EU member for 40 years, was very good at behind the scenes, while being a completely, like a participant in the EU institutions and processes, was very good at sort of making sure that things didn't go too far in certain directions. When you think of like, obviously diplomacy, but when you think of military, when you think of taxation, which our Irish friends can talk about, when you all those things were slowed down by Britain. And Britain was very good at any issue that they thought was the EU going too far. They were very good at sort of picking out certain allies within the 28 members, which they were when they left, and finding strategic allies to sort of sabotage little, to specific projects.
Lolita, if I can turn to you now, Lolita. I mean, I guess the prime examples, if we think about it, are Hungary and Poland, and there's a big debate with the Commission trying to make the budget, and that's been the debate over the last week, contingent upon both Poland and Hungary following the rule of law. What's Brexit's impact been on those two countries, for example?
Very interestingly, actually, the fact that the UK decided to leave in 2016, it did not immediately set in terms of having it easier to have this rule of law debate. However, gradually, the European Union was growing bolder and more resolute to address which were really serious rule of law issues in Hungary and Poland. And here I would really subscribe to what Alex was saying. Britain was using Hungary and Poland for its own purposes, but also Hungary, especially Hungary, was also using Britain for its own purposes. Because Hungary was actually, although sometimes Hungary looks a bit awkward on international stage, like this awkward relative from the periphery, it is actually very skillful in using its diplomacy for its own purposes. So it was very strongly playing the sovereignty card. And of course, it had ears and eyes of Britain in terms of this, always saying that any attacks on Hungary for its violations of rule of law principles are attacks on its sovereignty. So basically what we saw was that this whole rule of law debate was speeded up. And if EU was very slow with addressing those issues in Hungary, it was much faster with addressing these issues in Poland, which actually has not encroached on its rule of law to the same extent. And this definitely is connected to the fact that, that the UK is leaving, and starting already from 2016, it was having a completely different position vis-a-vis these issues.
Okay, we'll come back to the idea of Britain's role in European diplomacy and its impact on that in a moment. David, can we just talk about the impact in Northern Ireland? We know that Northern Ireland remains within the customs union, remains within the single market, if I'm right in saying. That from your perspective is a good thing or a bad thing? I mean, I'm just trying to think, because of the amount of trade that it goes on across the RSC with the rest of the UK. How do you think business, for starters, and then politicians feel about the result?
So the first thing is just to recognise that trade between Northern Ireland and Britain is about 4 times greater than trade between Northern Ireland and the Republic. So that's quite a big obstacle to confront when we're looking at the future. And obviously the European Union have been very, very sympathetic, recognising the fundamental international agreement, the Good Friday Agreement. So there was to be no border on the island of Ireland. I don't like the phrase, and in fact it was the DUP that came up with the phrase, a border down the RSC. I mean, it's an absurd comment, but it got currency and it became very widely used. But there are going to be significant checks that will take place between Britain and Northern Ireland. And it's also important to recognise in European Union terms that the island of Ireland is only 7 million people. So sometimes Ireland's, the emphasis of throughout all these negotiations, and going back to Alex's point, I think it's important just to say to all the viewers, everybody I think knows this, but both Northern Ireland and Scotland did not vote for leaving the European Union. Categorically not. And in the case of Northern Ireland, had the DUP taken a different view, which possibly today they would take if this was put in front of them now, then we would have had an emphatic 70%, in my view, possibly more, people voting to stay in the European Union.
Can you remind us what the percentage was in Northern Ireland?
So it ended up being 56-44, staying in the European Union. And the DUP did a lot of work. I think the final point I'd like to make is, I think it's very, very important in historical terms. This is the first time in the history of the island of Ireland that our sphere of influence has moved away. Although Northern Ireland remains part of the United Kingdom, you can definitely see in historical terms, this is a massive step away from what I call the sphere of influence. Certainly for Ireland, you can go back from partition in the accession to the EU in 73, and now today in 2021, as we move into 21, the first time Ireland has no longer been umbilically tied to Britain, although trade has moved massively towards the European Union. So even in the last few days, British politicians have clumsily said that 90% of trade is still going on between Ireland and Britain. That's not the case. It now represents probably less than 20% in all. Although a point that we'll come on to is, this isn't just about goods. This is actually about, much more importantly, invisible items.
So you're saying that because of the regulations being introduced across the RSC, businesses have already started sourcing their, changing their sources to within the Republic, to the Republic? Well,
we'll see how much that happens, but my view is yes, Nicholas, that is happening.
Well, right, I think it's really interesting also, David, that for a government so obsessed with sovereignty, they actually give up on one of the 4 nations, if you like, as part of the single market over which they'll have no say, and that for me is quite perplexing.
Well, I would say the words, as we always find out, the words speak louder than, sorry, the actions speak louder than the words. And there's no question the DUP feel completely uncomfortable as to what's happened to them.
Yeah, and I think obviously just to remind people, and I guess most people are aware, I mean, it all comes back to the Good Friday Agreement, and really the Good Friday Agreement being written within the context of the shared sovereignty of Europe. And once you pull out of that agreement is underwritten by both Northern Ireland and the Republic being within the European Union. And once you take away that membership, that becomes difficult, and that's where the contradiction comes, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, Britain hasn't come out of this very well in terms of its reputational damage, the way they played the Good Friday Agreement in every which way. And Michael Gove and the Prime Minister were pretty footloose and fancy free when it came to how important the Good Friday Agreement was. The reality was it didn't seem to be very important. And, you know, we were very close to this internal market bill creating chaos.
Right. And do you think they, from, you know, if you go back 4 years, because I know people like Theresa May would speak to you, do you think they realized the implications of Brexit when it came to the Good Friday Agreement?
No, I mean, just picking up on Lolita's point, it's very clear to me that one of the governments that have come out of this very well is the Irish government have handled this whole situation incredibly well. And again, I think it's left Britain feeling quite bruised to see how well the Irish have handled this overall.
Okay, we've only got just started on this discussion. I think there are going to be lots of questions. You may have questions about the nature of the deal itself. We've got a great panel. Alex Pigman he probably knows the deal inside out. I hope you do, Alex. So, you know, you might ask, why did fishing, for example, take up so much attention? Why were services left to one side? And what about the actual negotiations? Did the European negotiators actually think that Britain really was ready to do a no deal? Those are the kind of questions I think people might want to ask. But before we come to them, I want to roll the clock back slightly, Lolita, and just talk with you briefly, because you were there in that period just after 2016. You were in the Latvian Parliament, and this was a time when Britain was trying to engage countries one by one to see if they would support their cause. And I think you had a visit by David Davis at the time. Could you just talk a bit about that?
Yes, indeed. I was the chair of the European Affairs Committee, and Latvia had the rotating presidency of the European Union. And although we are a small country and a comparatively new EU member state, for half a year in 2015, we were a very important country. So basically, right after the Brexit referendum, we kind of had that inertia and continue to be kind of important. So we actually received quite a lot of bilateral visits in Latvia. And as a chair of the European Affairs Committee, I did meet British politicians at that time. And it was very surprising to what extent British politicians were unprepared for the challenges that they were facing. It was really quite incredible that we were having this nice dinner at the British Embassy, and the Brexit minister, David Davis, indeed told us that Northern Ireland is not a problem, it will take care of itself. Gibraltar is not a problem. We were asking about access to the single market. He said that this is not a problem. How about international trade deals? You haven't concluded any since you joining the European Union. What now is European Union in 1973. He said it's not a problem. So he did not understand the depth of this whole issue, and it was very astonishing. And I have to also mention another thing, that basically within the parliamentary cooperation, we actually had a parliamentary visit to Ireland. And we made a request that if we wanted to visit the Northern Irish border and to see how it works out, how it looks, how it physically looks, and how it will divide the country, this frictionless circulation. Afterwards, we had actually a parliamentary visit to the British Parliament, and we had a whole hearing in the House of Lords. And me and my colleague, who was the chair of Foreign Affairs Committee, we actually, in a detailed way told the House of Lords members of what it looked like physically, the border between Northern Ireland and the Republic of Ireland, and they were astonished. None of them had been there. And we, coming from a new, young, small EU member state, we had gone there, we had visited it, because we very quickly realized that this is going to be a problem. So this complete lack of awareness of what it was all about was astonishing. And just to follow on very briefly on Alex's point, why Britain did not manage to have this charm offensive of having bilateral deals was that we were all astonished of the extent that Britain did not realize what it had gone into. I remember we also had a bilateral visit to the French Senate, and we discussed this, and they shared their observation that your British politicians were completely unaware of all these many details that needed to be taken care of.
Alex, is that a fair comment to say? I mean, I guess you expect some division between politicians who've got ideals and civil servants who might not know, who might know a lot more. I mean, what was your view sitting in Brussels? And there must have been changes as well from both the May administration to the Johnson administration.
Well, that's true. I mean, but the May administration was definitely, I want to say, going after Brexit in name only, to use a Brexiteer kind of, where they were going after cake and eat it. They realized, I think really her government definitely saw their mandate as, okay, we have to deliver Brexit, but let's just make it as light as possible. And the services was something that they wanted to be included. And so what, and I get all the nomenclature of their various proposals because it's very English in the way, or British in the way that, it's like the speech at this place and the speech at that place. But their main proposal was basically trying to remain, have a big foot remaining in the sort of the institutional EU institutional policy making, while at the same time being Brexited. The arrival of Johnson had the merit of just bringing clarity and actually just made the whole story as a journalist easier to cover. Like this trade deal was easy to cover. It's like, can't do services, it's too complicated, and it requires giving up too much sovereignty. So can't do services, it's a trade deal, zero tariffs, zero quotas, off we go. And I'm putting aside the Irish question for a second. And so that's, for us, that was really what, that was what was really clear. But I mean, I completely agree with Lolita. I mean, that I'd say like the first year of Brexit was the realization that the British side had gotten into something that they just didn't understand. And I think, and it was the outgoing British ambassador to the EU, Sir Ivan Rogers, who quit very quickly after Theresa May became, after Brexit, because he basically was a Cassandra in the story. And he says, you guys have no idea what you've done. And he's since given speeches, written editorials incessantly since then. Because here's a guy who was also a member of the cabinet, in the commission, the guy who just knew so much, who basically was Britain's most senior, smartest guy in the room when it came to the EU policy. And he just walked out and he said, you guys don't know what you're doing. And so from that moment on, we knew that they were clueless, because we had someone on the British side actually saying, and the biggest authority on the subject saying, they're clueless. So that's that. But then again, and Theresa May, I think her whole time was basically the wake up to that fact. And Boris Johnson, and she obviously, crushed her in a way. Yeah.
Okay. Boris Johnson paints this as obviously a great success for the government, for the country. And he would say that Britain now can forge out a different kind of role in the world. How do you see Britain standing within Europe? What is the damage, if you like, done by this process? Because we have to admit that it has been very damaging to Britain's reputation. Lolita, just to start with you, and then we'll come on to Alex.
We were just from the beginning, we were shocked, astonished, and we were really very much trying to see this stance of as soft Brexit as possible. We were really kind of willing to see it develop. And when we realized that it wouldn't, when we saw that there was this very thin knowledge of what it actually means, and then of course was Boris Johnson becoming the prime minister, I think we in Europe, we just resigned to the idea that that's it, the UK is gone. And at the same time, seeing the pain of this going, I think so many of us realized that we just want to stay put. We don't want to go anywhere. And if anything, I heard, for instance, about the electoral campaign in Sweden that followed quite soon after the referendum. No one even mentioned any Swexits or anyone had any idea. So basically this huge pain that basically just resulted in a deal only now, it has really healed the European Union of all these ideas of leaving, because we've understood the whole extent to what it means. And it's just really so regrettable that in the times when actually this clever, balanced multilateralism has a potential to come back with the potentially new administration in the US, that Britain is gone from this scene, because obviously Britain is a big economy and a powerful country, but COVID has hit us all, and it's much better to be together, and it will be very hard to recover.
Yeah, Alex, I mean, we are still the 5th or 6th largest economy in the world. We like to say we punch above that weight. What's your assessment of that?
I think it's very much true, and you know, the English is the first, is the world's first language, and you know, the BBC has a huge influence on the world. You know, a bunch of multinationals are still today based in London and elsewhere, and we know, let's see if they remain there. So I think that there's definitely something to be said about that, but I think one of the major foundations of Britain punching above its weight, to mix metaphors, is was the fact that they were an EU member, you know, and they were a bit of a cynical, you know, they're an EU member with a wink. I mean, that's the way I've always seen Britain, and I think that's a way that, you know.
I mean, that's self-evident. We're no longer there, but what do people say in the corridors of power in Brussels, or what do they say in the ministries?
Oh, they say that they. I mean, it's an own goal. They've shot themselves in the foot. You just go on and on. I mean, it's just basically clearly something. You know, a government has just done is taken a very irrational act. All the signs, all the historical signs of the day are pointing in that direction, and they went in that direction. Yeah. They're an outlier. I mean, and I don't think you'll find anyone of any party, of any political persuasion, that would contradict that. I have yet to, in let's say in the last few years, you just don't see anyone who said, well, you know, the Brits, you know, keep an eye on them because it's going to be, you know, they're going to have their moment. You just don't hear it. And maybe everyone's wrong. I mean, I'm not saying that's not the case.
I see the Brexiteers logging out as we speak. Not happy to hear our comments on this. David, you've got you're going to add to this in a second. Please, can everyone start putting their comments and questions in the Q&A box here, just down here on your screen. You've got tons of questions. I know there's no excuse not to ask them now. David, go ahead.
So Alex, you touched on tax earlier on, and I think from a Republic of Ireland point of view, the success of Ireland undoubtedly has been connected to its tax rate. And if you watch the way the Irish government have protected that, it's been fundamental. So if this European unity agenda moves, that's going to be a pressure point for Ireland. But I'd like to make a point that goes back to the global financial crash. Everybody thought Ireland was going to be completely incapable of recovering, but it did recover. And not only did it recover, but it's important to say it's only a population of 5 million people, and Northern Ireland is 1.8. So together we're 7. But Ireland is one of the wealthiest countries now in Europe. And during the recovery, the Taoiseach was, as you know, Fine Gael got a very bad shock in the elections. And one of the issues was because of the straitjacket that the European Union imposed. And this is where the thing becomes very uncomfortable. And I think the European Union, you know, David Cameron had a lot of good points about where the European Union was going. And although they may be feeling very comfortable that Britain's left and we're great and they're not, and all the rest, I think it's important the European Union recognizes you can't go on building a bureaucracy that doesn't work on inequality. And this is one of the interesting agenda items. I don't see Johnson producing the goods behind the levelling up agenda, but the levelling up and the level of inequality that exists in Western nations, and America is just another insight, is a profound challenge. And the European Union has failed to address this point. And that becomes very, very important as we move to the next stage, because our democracy is at risk. And for a small country like Ireland, dealing with the levels of inequality, which are huge, needs attention. And the European Union failed to deal with this adequately during the crash. And, you know, there is a really important point. So if Johnson can prove his logic there, and I just make one final point on the Brits not knowing what they were doing. I accept the generality, but make no mistake, there are some very, very clever people in this government. And, you know, there are one or two people, Lolita, you talked about the border. I can tell you on personal, I wasn't there, but a guy took one of the most senior members of the Brexit campaign round Ireland. He knew every single port, he knew every single place. He was intimately aware of all the detail. So the Brits are very good at portraying this sort of sense in which, oh, we don't know. Some of them do. Some of them are highly intelligent human beings who've watched this, and it slightly goes back to your point, Nicholas. Maybe they recognize Northern Ireland, that moment's come. Maybe, I don't know.
I mean, the point I would make there, David, and I think this comes onto the discussion that we're having about the UK internally, is that I think Euroscepticism has its birth in a United Kingdom pre-devolution. And once you get to devolution, it's it's very difficult to roll back again. You've got and I think the Eurosceptics really didn't take that into account, and I think the sort of cabinet minutes will show this in years to come.
Although you could argue, Nicholas, there is actually something slightly different, and that is there is the Little Englander going on as well.
Yeah, I think it's the two things coinciding with each other, isn't it? It's sort of English nationalism, which was something we daren't talk about or say its name. Okay, we've got some questions coming through now here. Nigel Harley, so we'll just bring Nigel up, followed by Georg Blaha. So Isabel's just bringing up Nigel. While she's doing that, I'll just turn to Alex. Can you just repeat that question, Alex? That services make up 80% of the UK's economy. Fishing make up 0.5%. Why was there so much focus on fishing and nothing on services? You gave part of the answer earlier, but just go through that.
Well, no, I mean, because fishing had to be solved. I mean, because because all this fishing takes place by Europeans in UK waters, and so we just had to have a negotiation over that. And fishing negotiations are always incredibly painful, long, and they take place every year, and they're always just these big, huge, boxing matches that go on all night. And so already they're difficult. That's sort of built into the process of that. You just have these painful negotiations. And so so here you have a total reset of fishing of UK waters that needs to be negotiated. And it was going to be very, very tough. And there was some temptations that it should be separated completely, and that should just take place in its own track, and it shouldn't be mixed up with the trade. But they both sides agreed that they didn't want to do that. And so that's but the fact is, I think that the outcome of the fishing negotiation was quite predictable. I mean, the landing, we all sort of knew that would end up somewhere here, and we knew it would take on all this symbolic importance. But however, the sort of the nuts and bolts of the negotiation you kind of know what it's going to be.
Yes, so people, what is it for the next 5 years? What happens with British fishing waters and new vessels?
Well, I mean, basically, is that for the next 5 years, and there's a little bit of ambiguity on this, by the way, but for the next 5 years, the European fishing access will basically go down, and then it will be reduced by a certain amount, by 25%. And that's basically, and then at 5 years, in 5 years from now, that will be the new reality. However, what everyone's expecting is that, and this is something maybe we should talk about, maybe the questions will be about that, but everyone's expecting that this trade deal is just the beginning of a very, very, very long story. So I think most people are thinking in 5 years, let's see where we are, let's see what we're talking about, let's see who's in government, and then we'll so basically we have a 5-year deal.
Yeah, so that comes to the drag factor, I guess, when it comes to this cycle of ongoing of negotiations across a whole series of tech sectors. I saw an article about the music industry and bands not being able to travel in Europe because they can't stay beyond a 90-day period.
Yes,
so many things.
I mean, just to jump in and just to be clear, that all trade deals are, they capture every portion of society, and that's why they're fascinating. And that's something that this trade deal does, though it kept services out of it.
Yeah. Okay. Nigel, do you want to follow up on that? Because I know your question was about service. Nigel Harley.
Yeah, I'm really concerned, obviously, about the position of the City of London. I mean, we all recognise that there's a huge pool of talent there, and it's not going to collapse overnight. But the fact remains is that the Germans and the French have been very direct and say they're going to make a real effort to capture a lot of the business that goes on in the city. And I have a real concern about the government's attitude towards business. I mean, we know what Johnson said about business. And it's a very unsure situation.
Okay, let's we'll try and be succinct with the answers because we've got a lot of questions coming through. So David, you've got a banking background. You used to be in the city, so you chip in on this, and then we'll come to Alex as well. So David first, and then Alex.
So my own view is London will remain very sticky and will continue to thrive. But at the margin, I think it's interesting. Obviously, you've mentioned Frankfurt and Paris. I would mention Dublin as well.
Oh yes,
Dublin's
indeed.
become a very significant driving force,
Oh.
and obviously it'll be a process. But the one thing which does worry me is if the British attitude is ignorant, which sometimes it seems to be, that's not going to go down well anywhere in the world. So there needs to be a much more emollient, and I think you're beginning to see that a little bit with the Chancellor, who obviously understands the city very well. So it's all to play for, but there are big issues.
Alex, on services, what's going to happen next?
I mean, on services, everything will have to be done, on the major things will be done on equivalence. And so it'll be like Switzerland, and in the sense that, these things will be negotiated over, there'll be every year, every 2 years, they will have to negotiate equivalence deals so that the City of London can continue to function quite seamlessly with the Europeans.
Brexiternity, somebody labeled that.
Yeah.
Okay, Georg Blaha. Georg. Go ahead, Georg.
Yeah, thank you, Nicholas. I have a question for Lolita. And you're on the board of the European Council on Foreign Relations. And your organization published a very interesting proposal a few weeks ago, suggesting that the EU close ranks and pursue a more robust foreign policy and trade policy in order to protect its sovereignty as a bloc against the United States and China. And I was wondering where this strategy, if it were followed, it sounds reasonably enough, but where would it leave Britain, and where would it leave the UK? Would it be part of the...
I know you work with ECFR, but this may not be your area of expertise, but do go ahead and answer it. I know Alex will have some comments as well, but go ahead, Lolita.
I can just say that In general, I think there is a realization in the European Union that it indeed needs to strengthen itself. And this really brings me back to the point that David made about inequality, but also about the fundamentals of democracy and also resilience of society to withstand, for instance, pressures of disinformation. And then, of course, this internal strengthening that the EU is engaging into by launching a democracy fund and different other initiatives. Of course, it carries over to foreign policy in terms of really having this more united and a stronger voice in terms of as a bloc. And I just can again express my regret that the UK is not on board, because it has wonderful experience in these particular things. It's doing so much in development assistance, and it would be definitely much better if we all did it together.
Alex, do you want to answer that? And also, where would it leave the UK? I mean, the UK wants to sort of be freewheeling and do its own thing with relations with China and certainly with the US. But the question here is if the EU pulls its act together and becomes more robust, what would the impact be? Also, do you see that happening as well, Alex?
Yeah, look, I mean, the EU is, when I say the EU, I mean that like the institutions, the Commission and the Parliament are very actively trying to pursue this idea of a stronger, more assertive EU foreign policy. I don't think it's something you can create from the head down. I mean, I just think it has to sort of naturally happening. I think we can all agree that it is kind of naturally happening. I think Trump was the best thing that ever happened to that cause. And Xi Jinping is not bad either. But it's not something you can just sort of create, and it's happening very, very slowly, and much more slowly than the Commission is, and I dare say someone like Emmanuel Macron in France are willing to let on. So I don't think it's something that is happening. It needs to happen, but how do you make that? I think no one really knows. And just very quickly, I do think that the values are there, but right now, and then also the problems, everyone knows what the problems are, but on the EU level, when it comes to inequality, and I'm not saying that the EU has any answers for these things, and quite to the contrary, the only answer they usually have when a crisis happens or when there's a major problem taking place, whether it's COVID or financial crisis, is that they hold summits. And right now, the only institution that is really trusted to be able to answer for Europe on a European level is the European Council, is the EU summits, and they have become rather addicted to these summits. And they can be quite effective. I mean, we just saw it with the recovery fund, 750 billion, which was, basically willed by France and Germany. But that's where it's taking place now. And I dare say, when in summits, when they get together and they meet for days on end, sometimes they can come up with something that's quite assertive. It usually gets picked apart later, but that's where the action is right now.
Alex, I'm going to come in a second to a question from Sheila de Beleg in a moment. But Alex, I just want to follow up what we were talking about earlier in terms of that, the EU being able to deal with the huge inequalities of wealth. The thing that's struck me throughout my time as a reporter is the enormity of the EU's institutions. And in Britain, we're detached from Europe. We've got this history behind us that has led in part to Brexit. But if you're from any European country, you've lived under dictatorship, or you've been occupied by another country, there are existential reasons why you belong to the European Union. But having said that, it is the institutions are so enormous, are so big and so distant from ordinary voters. How can you understand the difference between the European Council and the Council of Europe? Do you know what the commissions do? What is the difference between the European Parliament? What does the court in Luxembourg do? Now, you and I might know what this is, but we are an extreme minority. And this makes politics and the business of solving those questions very different. And that's what I would think is whilst you see the Europe coming together, that's a potential weakness in times of difficulty?
First, I mean, there's a little bit of a fact-checking thing that needs to go, is that, there's the same amount of civil servants at the European Commission as there is at the mayor of Paris, 30,000. I mean,
it's a very efficient bureaucracy, but it's still remote.
Yeah, I mean, it's remote. However, there's no question that major reforms of the EU institutions have to take place, and there's beginnings of trying to do that, but the referendums of 2005 just completely freaked everyone out, and Brexit to a certain degree did as well. And in those referendums, France voted against the EU constitution, as did the Netherlands, and those are two, those were two founding members of the European Union. And as soon as they voted against it, then you couldn't go forward. But everyone knows somehow it's going to happen, and that the planets are going to align one day for treaty change to happen and for all this to be reformed. However, I will say on a different level, the COVID crisis is a pretty good example of where the EU is sort of beginning to take on something is becoming a little less remote. It's very incremental. It's over a long period of time, but it's not. It is by every year it becomes a little less confusing and a bit more understandable to Europeans. It's very, again, small, slow, but I think it's pointing in that direction. And the last point is that I think I was speaking to you earlier when I was saying, I was saying that those arguments that you're mentioning, and you hear them in all European countries, but they were really brought home forcefully by the UK media, and the fact that the UK has left the European Union, those kind of debates about like, oh, what are those bureaucrats up to anyway, have subsided. I mean, I've noticed it already in the 5 years. There's big questions about like, why are they going to Strasbourg and not, there are certain questions, but kind of like let's say the broad stroke kind of like, what the hell are you guys doing over there anyway? With Nigel Farage gone and with the Brits gone, that debate has become a little bit less pertinent, I dare say.
Okay, Lolita, would you agree with that? Sorry, Sheila, I'll come on to you in just a second. Lolita, would you agree?
Yes, I believe that basically, I think when everything is fine, people pick on and complain about small things. And when they realize that there is a potential of an existential crisis, then they somehow start seeing the basics more clearly. And we actually saw this, that after the Brexit referendum, there was a period of existential crisis, but then with the election of Macron as the French president, and afterwards in the European Parliament elections in 2019, which actually saw an increased turnout of people. Somehow, I believe that people started realizing what this project is all about. Understanding that, okay, we can complain about bureaucracy, but then again, it is relatively small compared to other countries' bureaucracies. This project has maintained peace in the continent that has a horrible history. It actually gives benefits of scale. It increases individual countries' voice. And we have to remember that the European Union is a union of very small states. 20 states out of 27 EU members are well below or around 10 million inhabitants. So this is a union of small states. And not realizing this, that with growing power of China, was strange moves from the US President Trump, that not use this vehicle for enhancing each of our voices. For instance, Netherlands is a small country, but it is so well heard globally because it is a very active member of the European Union. Not realizing this somehow is really not giving it justice. And I think that also the politicians have become more responsible in the way how they use their argumentation also in national debates, because there used to be this line of argumentation that the European Union was always blamed for everything. I think there now is much more ownership emanating from national parliaments and also national governments. And unfortunately, this is what Brexit has done to this project to a large extent.
Thank you for that, Lolita. Sheila de Blake.
Hello, that's all very interesting and bears on what I was thinking, which is it is ironic that Brexit has had this effect, which Brexiteers would not have wanted, of strengthening the EU and causing it to close ranks. And my question is really counterfactual and not very helpful, but would we have got a better deal? Might we have got a better deal had not Johnson and Gove come to power and put the backs of the Europeans up against us?
It's a big hypothetical, but I mean, David, May failed so badly. I mean, she just left the door wide open for Boris. David?
It was inevitable that Gove and Johnson would be here, so there was no counterfactual in it. They were always going to be there at some point. I mean, I'd like to just slightly go back to Lolita's point, which I think is interesting, and it sort of goes to Sheila's question. I think it's very interesting to look at how Northern Ireland and Ireland have responded. Northern Ireland has had no voice in the European Union, hardly at all. We had Dr. Paisley at one stage, and we've had various MEPs. But if you compare, picking up on Lolita's point, and this is, I think, a very, very powerful point that, Lolita, you've made today, and I don't think the European Union gets across at all, is if the European Union is a member, is a community of small states, which gives witness to small states, that's a very powerful story, and Ireland is a living testament to that. Northern Ireland sublimated itself foolishly with Britain in the European Union. And as a result, I mean, today, the GDP in Northern Ireland, well, today, 2018, just for the facts, this is a report that the CBI produced with IBEC, which is our sister body on the island of Ireland. Our average GDP in Northern Ireland is €27,400, and the Republic of Ireland is €58,800. So if you go to the history of the way Ireland's dealt with itself, when I studied economics at Trinity College, the development and underdevelopment of the island of Ireland was very poignant, and Northern Ireland was much richer than the Republic. Today, it's absolutely the other way around, and will remain the case for a long, long time until we find a solution, rather like East Germany, West Germany. So I think there is a big, but bureaucracy is a problem for everybody in Europe. For every single citizen, if the citizen doesn't feel that that person's been looked after, we have a problem. And that's what I feel is what Johnson's fumbling around with, is something around this, is inequality is a big issue. And we need to be very careful that we don't ignore this in the rejoicing of how great the European Union is. Because if you don't tackle inequality, you have a problem.
Okay, Jim Lowenstein has got a question as well. Jim, I think this goes into next week's debate, which is more about the internal impacts of Brexit on the UK. But go ahead, let's see what our panelists think of it. Go ahead, Jim.
Well, eventually, is this going to lead to Scotland's leaving the United Kingdom? There has to be another referendum, etc. But what do you think?
So I have to say, Political Tours has been running discussions on the breakup of the UK since about 2013, 2014. And we haven't had much take, actually. We've only had Australians traveling with us in Scotland to look at Scotland's potential breakaway. So the English don't take this idea very seriously, or haven't taken this idea very seriously. But now you see the magazines and the broadsheets running stories on this regularly. Now, I know none of you are constitutional experts or UK constitutional experts, but have a go at this one. Alex, what's your reckoning? Alex.
I have to say it's one of the ones I just sort of like stand back, but it's what everyone says. And and my understanding of the Scottish referendum, the first time around, was that the argument for
the first time around was back in 1979, I think, and got short shrift. It had too few people voting for it to count.
Yeah, that's right. No, but I mean the one from 2013, or I mean, in that vote, it was just like my understanding is that the arguments for voting against independence of Scotland were quite pragmatic and economic. And so when people ask me that question in real life, I'm saying, well, all those arguments have, I think, disappeared. So it would be interesting to see what would happen if the vote took place again. I mean, that's honestly my 2 cents.
David, as somebody who lives in Northern Ireland, you have a very keen eye for UK constitutional questions. What goes first, Northern Ireland or Scotland?
So Scotland's a different animal to Northern Ireland. The Good Friday Agreement changes the landscape completely. And obviously, we cannot afford to have anything other than peace. So in Scotland, you don't have that problem, although there are deep sectarian issues in Scotland which don't get exposed. My own view is, to answer Jim's question very directly, I think Scotland is picking, it's almost picking up on Lolita's point. If the European Union chooses to work with Scotland, then I think you're in a very interesting place. And there's no question that Johnson is not good for Britain in this context. As you know, he was very maladroit on devolution the other day. And that was an incredibly stupid comment that he made on devolution. So I think Scotland will go. I think Northern Ireland will also go. But there's a different dynamic, and it's not worth putting them in a horse race.
But for those who don't know, what did Boris say about devolution?
He basically said it was a disaster.
Yeah. Okay, Jim, I mean, it's a huge topic and we're going to get into it next time, but have you got any follow-up to that at all, Jim? No, go on, Jim.
No, I don't.
No, okay. We're going to have another discussion on this, and we'll be looking much more closely at the sort of constitutional fallout from Brexit. So we'll have plenty more time to look at it. Lolita, it's the very idea of the UK breaking up seemed possibly unfathomable to most people around the world. I mean, do you have any views on it?
I just remembering from my rather young youth of how the whole awakening and breaking away from the Soviet Union happened here, I know that these things are very emotional. And I think that Boris Johnson has been rather crude with Scottish emotions. I think Theresa May was rather crude with Scottish emotions about this. But probably this line has continued and strengthened. And we did have a visit to Scotland while I was a member of Parliament of Latvia. And I felt that this emotion is rather strong, that Scottish are not being listened to, that given the size of population and the territory, and given the way how, again, the European Union is a union of small states, I felt that this emotion is gravitating towards a potential outcome that would be contrary to what the previous one was. And I think that in such things, handling this emotion is very important. And I think the British government is just not paying enough attention to this.
Yeah, from my point of view, the lack of awareness of the implications of Brexit and the feelings and demands of the separate nations astounds me. And I think we're going to, when we have this discussion, also that we live on the Welsh border, and the votes for Welsh independence have increased, and I think they'll continue to increase over the next few years quite dramatically. That's it, everyone. Thank you very much for the discussion. It's been really, really enjoyable. Our panelists are welcome to stay online when we have our after debate discussion. But I'm going to say thank you to all now. That's to Lolita Cigane, David Gavigan, and Alex Pigman. It's been really, really interesting. We will have another discussion on Brexit in January.